Let me just do one more stop with you. And that's now at the heart of the Paschal mystery, the heart of evangelization, the cross and resurrection of Jesus.
In this clip, Bishop Barron stuns the English Parliament with the paradoxical beauty of the Christian faith. The main point of his talk was to argue for Christianity and its contribution that it makes to society. Be sure to stick around to the end because Bishop Barron summarizes in a sentence or two what he believes Christianity contributes and provides to society at large. Check this out.
How strange the cross is. And in a way, we have to back away from our own experience of the cross. I'm wearing this, decorative cross, and we naturally say, well, what a lovely religious symbol, and it evokes, peace and prayerfulness, etc. No. We've got to go back to 2,000 years ago. And if someone, saw me walking around wearing this, and they said, yeah, that's a religious leader, they think I had utterly lost my mind, right? Because this was meant to terrify people in the ancient world. Yeah, one of the clues, it's very interesting. Read Paul to the Romans, and you'll find this peculiar line. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. What a strange thing to say. I mean, could you imagine Confucius saying, by the way, let me just preface my remarks by saying, I'm not ashamed of the ethics I'm going to teach. Well, no, of course not. He thinks they're wonderful. You couldn't imagine the Buddha saying, let me just say as I begin that I'm not ashamed of the Eightfold Path. No, this is the path of liberation. Muhammad would never say in a million years, by the way, I'm not ashamed of the Quran. So, why does Paul say that? Because I preach one thing, Christ, and him crucified. What? It would have struck people in the ancient world as a supreme anomaly that you be proclaiming someone crucified. The Romans got the practice, they think, from the Persians, but the Romans certainly perfected it. Stripping someone naked, that was part of the humiliation of the torture. Nailing them or roping them, tying them to this crossbeam, and then leaving the person to die in this literally excruciating way, right? Ex cruce, from the cross. Often taking days to die, and then being left for the wild animals to devour the body. It was like the most horrific thing. That's why it was reserved only for the most despised in Roman society, and for slaves, and for those who were considered lowest. Moreover, it would have been the clearest indication possible that you were not the Messiah of Israel. Because one of the marks of the Messiah was he would deal with Israel's enemies, and he would reign as Lord of the nations. Read the Psalms and read the prophets as they describe the messianic task. They would deal with Israel's enemies. They would reign as the Lord. So the clearest indication possible that you were not the Messiah is that you were crucified by Israel's enemies. So, and your own N.T. Wright has made this point over and over again. From a purely historical standpoint, what's exceptionally hard to explain is how in the world these Christians launched a messianic movement while they were proclaiming this. Because the beautiful thing is they didn't hide it for a second, did they? They didn't hide the cross. Paul puts it out there. That's the one thing I talk about. That's the one thing I'm going to tell you about is Jesus crucified. And I'm going to declare him to be the Mashiach, Christos, the Christ of Israel. How do you explain that? I can't give you a whole disquisition, but I think the only, even from an historical standpoint, the fact of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. If Jesus had died on the cross, remained in his grave, who cares? Who cares? When I was coming of age, there were a lot of attempts in the academic world to, turn it into a myth or a legend or a symbol or a sign of Jesus' ethics going on. Who cares? Bore me to death with that. Paul wouldn't have cared one bit about that. Paul did not tear into these cities and say, hey, everybody, there's a dead man whose ethics is very inspiring. No, what Paul said over and over again is anastasis, resurrection. And it's the only way to explain the coming together of this proclamation, of this strange instrument of torture. This is the Paschal mystery, everybody. It's the evangel. This is the good news. So how did they read these two things together? And I'm going to suggest it now in light of what I've been talking about. How do they read together the dying and the rising of Jesus? What do they see in the cross? But all the effects of bad worship. read the passion narratives, and you have cruelty, and you have hatred, and you have violence, and you have stupidity, and you have institutional injustice. You have every permutation and combination of human dysfunction, all of which on the biblical reading are born of bad worship. When you say Jesus took upon himself the sins of the world, that's what it means, that on the cross we see everything that bedevils us and terrifies us, everything that goes wrong with us. But in the resurrection, they saw that God's love is more powerful than all of that. Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. That all of the dysfunction of the unorthodox world, I mean the world that worships wrong, all of that is swallowed up by the divine mercy. You know, something in the resurrection accounts that's so important, I think, is, let's say we were telling the story in a Hollywood way today. You know, so this wonderful person, this innocent man, is done to death and betrayed, and he's denied by his own friends and put to death brutally, and then he's back from the dead. We would do it. He'd have a machine gun like Rambo or something, or he'd be attacking his enemy. Or if Quentin Tarantino would make that story, he'd seek revenge, right? But the fact that in the resurrection accounts, Jesus always does two basic things: is he shows his wounds. Very important move, isn't it? The wounds of Jesus are meant to signal the dysfunction of the world. Don't play the game of I'm okay and you're okay and everything's fine and we're all doing basically well. No. The wounds of Jesus remind us of our dysfunction. But then, having shown his wounds, he always says, Shalom, the peace. In martial arts, there's a move that's called a discipline called aikido. And aikido is not direct punching back or fighting back. Rather, it's using the momentum of your enemy against them, right? So you definitely get out of the way, or you use the movement of your enemy to throw him to the ground. The purpose of aikido is not to destroy your enemy, but I heard a practitioner of it say this to me, to leave him laughing on the ground, to realize that I can't beat this person. He always has a way of outmaneuvering me. Can you see the nonviolence in the Sermon on the Mount? And above all, the cross and resurrection as a kind of sacred aikido. Jesus taking upon himself the sin of the world and then deftly outmaneuvering it, not fighting it on its own terms. That's the Rambo, mythology, which is as old as the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? That story's been told again and again and again. Then there's this story. Then there's this story. The dysfunction of the world undone by the love and forgiveness and shalom of the Creator. I think everybody, that's what they saw. That's what they saw. That was the good news. That was the evangel. And so Paul goes now careering around the world, and he wanted to go to Rome. He ended up in Rome. He wanted to go to Spain. He wanted to go to the ends of the world to declare there's a new Kyrios. There's a new Lord. Because he saw in the cross and the resurrection that a great victory had been won. I want to read you this. I'll close with this. That marvelous quote from Colossians. He, Jesus, this is Paul speaking, he disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them. Now, what's he talking about? But the Roman practice of parading one's conquered enemies through the streets. Think of Caesar and Vercingetorix, right? Bringing him back from Gaul and then parading him through, I conquered this man. I make a public display of him. So Paul imagines the powers and principalities, all those powers predicated upon false worship, undone now, undone by the cross and resurrection of Jesus. That's what we brought everyone to the public conversation for the past 2,000 years. I'll close with this image. I'm staying in the hotel right across the river there, and my room is a spectacular view of this whole complex, right? So I've been contemplating it quite a bit the last couple of days. And you notice the beautiful, Pugian neo-Gothic architecture silhouetted against the sky. But then you see hovering over the whole thing is the Union Jack, which, if I'm right, is 3 crosses, right? One on top of the other. How weird, everybody, isn't it? How weird that at the center of that design is the gibbet, is the instrument of torture on which this young Jewish rabbi was put to death 2,000 years ago. You see, we're like Paul. We're not embarrassed by it. We're not ashamed of it. We hold it up because that cross is now seen as the sign of conquest, that God's love and God's peace, God's nonviolence is greater than anything in the world. That's what we continue to bring to the public conversation. That, I think, is the dynamite of the church.
So what does Christianity offer to society? It offers the love, peace, and nonviolence of God into a world full of hate, conflict, and war. God triumphs over the evil in this world and does so by offering himself to any who choose. You see, we live in a world that longs for identity, that longs for purpose and meaning, that longs for satisfaction. But the reality is that in a temporal world where everything fades, where everything turns to dust, all satisfaction is temporary, which means you end up in despair. All identity is temporary, which means you lose yourself. You can't find yourself, and you long to find what you were made for. And there's a purpose and meaning that can last for a while, but it fades, and that makes us sad. It makes us in angst. It makes us depressed. The only way that we can have a society, and society is built upon these things, of trying to find identity, trying to find a purpose, trying to find satisfaction. All societies, if they are not built on Christianity, which is the only answer to these questions of, existential angst of existence, if we do not have a society that's built upon Christianity, our society will implode. Christianity is the only worldview, it's the only religion that can give you true satisfaction, because it gives you an identity that is not rooted in yourself, but is in Christ, and it sends you on mission and takes you out of yourself so that you can find a meaning and a purpose that transcends your own egotistical wants. This is why we need Christianity. I think that the main reason why we have hate, conflict, and war is because we have people that are confused about their identity. They're confused about what will actually bring them satisfaction. They're confused about what their ultimate purpose is. Christianity leads you to Christ, leads you to God, and in finding him, you can let go of your own self-innovation and start to find a true discovery of who you truly were meant to be and what truly makes you happy in Christ. And I think when we do that, the violence goes away, peace begins to surpass our understanding, as the scriptures talks about, and love abides and abounds. Be thinking about that today. We need Christianity in our society. It's the only thing that can truly transform and sustain this world. All right, that's all I have for this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Remember that Christianity is Christ, and without Christ, there is no Christianity.